I want to start with a confession. When I first made my 3 predictions in May 2024, Trump wins, America goes to war with Iran, America loses that war, most of my students laughed, not dismissively. They just found it hard to believe that someone standing in a Beijing classroom could see something that the entire apparatus of Washington, with its trillion-dollar intelligence agencies and its armies of PhDs, could not. But here is what I told them then, and what I will tell you now. I am not smarter than anyone in Washington. I am not more informed. What I have is simply a different framework, a different way of reading history. And right now, that framework is pointing to 3 questions, 3 specific pressure points that will determine not just the outcome of this war, but the shape of the world your children will inherit. Question 1. Will the United States send ground troops into Iran? Question 2. Will nuclear weapons be used? Question 3. Will the Al-Aqsa Mosque be destroyed? These are not hypothetical, they are live. And by the time we finish today, I think you will see them the way I see them. Not as random events driven by unpredictable chaos, but as the logical, predictable outputs of a system that has been building toward this moment for decades. Let me show you the system. I teach something I call predictive history. It is not prophecy. It is not guessing. It is pattern recognition applied to civilizational cycles, combined with game theory, the science of strategic decision-making under conditions of conflict. Here is the core principle. Nations, like people, do not make decisions based on what is rational. They make decisions based on what they are incentivized to do. And those incentives are almost always structural, meaning they are baked into the system long before any individual leader ever walks into the room. This is why I could predict Trump's election, not because I knew Trump, but because I understood the structural incentives that were pulling American domestic politics in a specific direction. The same logic applies to this war. So let us begin. Right now, America is fighting what military strategists call a war of destruction. Airstrikes, missiles, precision bombing. The goal, if we are honest about what we are watching on the ground, is to destroy the Iranian government's capacity to deliver basic services to its people. But there is a problem with a war of destruction. It has no end point. You can bomb a country indefinitely and never win it. The British learned this. The Americans learned this in Vietnam. They learned it again in Afghanistan. Destruction from the air does not produce political outcomes. Political outcomes require boots on the ground, someone to hold territory, someone to enforce order, someone to administer the aftermath. This is why I believe with a high degree of confidence that ground troops are coming. Not because anyone in Washington wants them, but because the logic of escalation demands them. Let me explain what I mean by escalation logic. This is not a simple concept, but it is essential to understanding everything that follows. In game theory, escalation follows a ladder. Each rung is a choice. And here is the critical point that most people miss. You cannot skip rungs. You do not go from an airstrike to a peace negotiation in one move. The ladder only climbs. And at each rung, the political cost of stepping back becomes greater than the political cost of stepping forward. This is what happened in Vietnam. It started with advisors, then security forces, then combat troops, then 500,000 soldiers. No one planned for that outcome. No one decided in a single meeting to commit 500,000 men to a jungle war. It happened one rung at a time, driven not by strategy, but by the structural logic of escalation itself. Now apply this to Iran. America begins with airstrikes. Iran retaliates against bases, against oil infrastructure in the Gulf, against American assets in the region. American soldiers die. The public demands a response. Washington sends special operations forces. A mission fails. More troops go in to extract them. Iran's mountainous terrain, geography that makes Afghanistan look like a parking lot, begins to swallow them. And suddenly, America is in a ground war in a country of 88 million people. Here is what makes Iran categorically different from Iraq or Afghanistan. In Iran, you are not fighting a fractured society. You are fighting a nation with 2,500 years of civilizational continuity. A nation that has been preparing for this confrontation for 20 years. A nation whose religious framework tells its people explicitly that this is a war against the great Satan, meaning surrender is not just a military defeat. It is a spiritual betrayal. And here's the number that should stop every American policymaker cold. Analysts have estimated that a full occupation of Iran would require somewhere between 3 and 4 million troops. The entire active duty US military is approximately 1.3 million people. You do the arithmetic. This is the Iran trap. Not because Iran is stronger than America in any conventional military sense, but because Iran has turned the structural logic of escalation into a weapon. Every American escalation plays into Iran's strategy. Every rung America climbs on that ladder makes America weaker, not stronger. The prediction, yes, ground troops are coming. Not because it is wise, but because once you start climbing the ladder, the momentum carries you. This is the question that produces the most fear. And I understand why. The scenario seems plausible on its face. Israel, feeling that conventional warfare is insufficient, reaches for the ultimate weapon. But I am going to give you a firm answer. No, nuclear weapons will not be used. And I'm not saying this to be reassuring. I am saying it because the game theory is unambiguous. Let me introduce you to the concept I consider the single most important law of geopolitical conflict. Control is more important than dominance. Most people think about military power the way they think about a fistfight. The bigger the weapon, the more power you have. The person with the gun beats the person with the knife. But that logic completely ignores the strategic environment in which the fight takes place. A nuclear strike is not just a military action. It is a civilizational declaration. And the moment you make that declaration, you do not gain power. You lose it catastrophically and irreversibly. Think about what happens the morning after a nuclear strike. Every alliance Israel has built over 7 decades collapses overnight. The United States, regardless of what is happening in Washington, cannot publicly support a nuclear aggressor. Europe, already uncomfortable with the war, withdraws all diplomatic cover. The Islamic world, 2 billion people, does not simply protest, it mobilizes. And China and Russia, who have been watching from the sidelines, are handed the single greatest propaganda gift in the history of geopolitics. More fundamentally, a nuclear strike eliminates the one thing that wins wars in the modern era: strategic flexibility, the ability to calibrate your response, to escalate just enough, to apply pressure without losing your alliances, your credibility, your moral standing. Nuclear weapons are, by definition, the opposite of calibration. They are a sledgehammer in a situation that requires a scalpel, and the strategist who reaches for a sledgehammer when a scalpel is needed has already admitted they do not know how to win. So no, not in this war, not at this time. The taboo holds, not because of treaties, not because of international law, but because breaking it is strategic suicide. And now we arrive at the third question, the one that geopolitical analysts discuss in private and almost no one discusses in public, because it sits at an intersection that our secular rationalist frameworks are not equipped to analyze. It sits at the intersection of religion, politics, and war. Let me give you the historical context. The Al-Aqsa Mosque stands at the center of Jerusalem. It is the third holiest site in Islam. Muslims believe it is the site from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. It is not negotiable. It is not a political bargaining chip. It is sacred ground in the most literal theological sense. But here is what our secular frameworks often fail to understand. For certain religious communities, this site is not just a place. It is a prophetic destiny. In certain strands of Jewish religious thought, the third temple, the literal house of God, must be built on this site. That is not fringe theology. That is a belief held with absolute conviction by a growing number of people who are, right now, sitting in the Israeli government. I want to be careful here. I am not describing all Jewish people. I am not describing all Israelis. I am describing a specific political religious tendency that has, over the past decade, moved from the margins of Israeli society toward the center of power. And this is where it becomes a geopolitical flashpoint of the first order. Here is my prediction, and I offer it soberly. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is in danger, and if it is destroyed, we are looking at a civilizational earthquake that no one is prepared for. 2 billion Muslims do not simply share a political identity, they share a spiritual obligation. The destruction of Al-Aqsa would not produce a protest movement. It would produce a religious mobilization, a sense of sacred duty that would cross every national border, every ethnic division, every political faction within the Islamic world. You can negotiate with politicians. You can reason with generals. You cannot negotiate with someone who believes they are carrying out a divine mandate. This is what makes the third question different from the first two. The first two are driven by strategic logic, the logic of escalation, the logic of dominance versus control. The third is driven by something deeper, by the kind of conviction that has started and sustained civilizational wars throughout all of human history. And history tells us something very clear about what happens when political actors who hold apocalyptic religious beliefs gain access to military power during a major war. The results are never small. They are never contained. They are, by definition, world-changing. Let me step back and give you the civilizational frame, because these three questions do not exist in isolation. They are symptoms of something much larger. I have argued for years that we are living through the terminal phase of American hegemony, not because America is weak in any absolute sense, but because the system America built after World War II, a rules-based international order designed, as the Canadians themselves have admitted, primarily for American benefit, is no longer delivering the outcomes that justified its existence. The Gulf states, who were the financial foundation of the petrodollar system, are exposed. Their wealth is built on infrastructure that Iran can target at will. Their populations are small. Their armies are dependent on American protection. And the moment that protection looks unreliable, the moment America gets trapped in a ground war, the entire financial architecture that has sustained American hegemony since 1973 begins to crack. China and Japan and South Korea are watching the Strait of Hormuz with acute anxiety. 40% of the world's traded oil passes through that choke point. Iran knows this, and Iran's strategy is not to win a military battle. It is to fight a war of attrition, to impose costs on the global economy, costs that will eventually force Trump's Gulf allies to pressure Washington to end the war. This is what I mean when I say Iran is not fighting to win. Iran is fighting to not lose. And in a war of attrition, not losing is winning. America, by contrast, is fighting a war with no defined objective, no political will at home. 70 to 80% of Americans opposed this war before it started. And a military bureaucracy that, as I have argued in my lectures, has spent the last 2 decades optimizing for the wrong metrics. Not fighting capacity, not strategic vision, but political compliance and administrative efficiency. The generals Washington has produced are not warriors, they are clerks. And clerks do not win wars of attrition against people who believe they are fighting for their civilizational survival. So let me bring it together. 3 questions, 3 predictions. Ground troops, yes, not because anyone plans for it, but because the escalation ladder only goes one direction, and the structural logic of this conflict makes it almost inevitable. Nuclear weapons. No, because control is more important than dominance, and using a nuclear weapon is the fastest way to lose all strategic control. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in danger, and if it falls, we are no longer talking about a regional war. We are talking about a civilizational conflict that will reshape the global order in ways that no one, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in Tehran, can fully predict. Now, I want to be honest with you, these are predictions, not prophecies. History is not deterministic. Human agency matters. There are people in every capital right now who are trying to find an off-ramp, who understand what is at stake, who do not want to see any of these three outcomes. But the structural forces that are driving this conflict are very powerful. And the lesson of history, the lesson I have spent my career teaching, is that structural forces tend to win. The question is not whether these forces are real. The question is whether anyone with enough power and enough courage will step in front of them before it is too late. That is the question I leave you with today.